Hey everybody, welcome to Real Men Feel. This is your host, Andy Grant, and welcome to episode 42, the first episode of 2017. Whew.
Woo!
Yeah, celebration, baby. I need some dancing girls and music. Get this going.
Normally, I'm the one who's doing woo.
Well, here's your chance. With me, as always, my
just
friend
did
and
it.
co-host, Apio Hunter, for his woo.
Right? Woo!
Yay. Cool. So tonight's show, we have more of residual positive effects from my participation in the New Warrior training with the Mankind Project. We're going to have, our guest is Ben Gaddis, who I met through the Mankind Project. We met at what's called Homecoming. It's after the actual event of the weekend. And Ben might have been the first person who came up to me that I didn't know saying he listened to the podcast and really dug it. And that gets you an automatic invite. Welcome, Ben Gaddis.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure to have you.
Great to be with you guys. For those who weren't with us, with the two of us, we spent a lot of time laughing and fucking around before this. So I just, and Andy asked me, like, how do you want to start? And I said, let's just keep fucking around. And here we are. So
Indeed. And it's
happy
kind of
to be fucking around with you guys.
That totally works.
I love that we're already laughing and stuff because the topic of tonight was going to be looking at sexual abuse, and you really had an interesting take in that, talking about humanizing it and looking at both sides of it. So why don't we dive in? And so, like, where does your experience around this issue come from?
Okay, yeah. I mean, so I'll say first of all, yeah, the obvious reason to me of why I, spent so much time laughing and fucking around with you guys is because of how nervous I am to be talking about a subject that I've been thinking about since I was probably around 12, in a pretty serious way, in a learning about and figuring out kind of way. And I do work with sexual abuse professionally, and I have for a few years now. But it's really a topic and a subject that I've had to feel my way through many different sides of for, almost 20 years, I guess. So that's really the core of my experience, is things that I experienced as a teenager, as a young kid. So with your permission, I guess I can sort of jump right into that, and that's what makes me nervous too. I mean, it's not every day in my work as a therapist or in my work that I'm doing now with prevention that I tell my whole story and then also talk about the professional aspects of it, So let's see. So I am 30 years old now. When I was around 12, 13, I found myself being very strongly attracted to a friend of mine. And I basically, to say that I abused him is I've found that I've had to backpedal on that term, because it was, I pressured him into, doing sexual things with me, a couple of times. And then I afterward was so terrified of being found out, being thought of as gay, in middle school, that I told him I would kill him if he told anybody. He quickly moved away, right after that, and I haven't talked to him since.
Wow.
So starting when I was 12 and 13, I had this experience of what at the time I really thought of as perpetration, that I had done something violent, and I spent a long time you know, researching. I was precocious as ever kind of kid. The internet was just being born. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I was and who I was and what I had done and what the consequences of it were morally.
So Ben,
Yeah.
even at the age of 12, you decided you had been a perpetrator.
Right. Yeah. There was a lot of other things that I had decided. In fact, it's interesting, you know, I did not even decide that I was gay or that I knew I was gay, or as I know now that I'm bisexual, but that label of I did something terrible, I am a perpetrator, that just fit right in there with me. And you know, what I know now about it is that really has to do with the core of shame that I just grew up with, and that it was just ready for me to, it fit right in for me, you know.
So is that almost this shame was looking for an action to give yourself more shame about?
Yeah, I mean, something like that. You know, I don't have it totally nailed down, but I think, yeah, just, you know, the way I felt about myself, as you know, so many 12-year-old boys do feel about themselves.
So just in the initial putting the pressure on your friend,
mm-hmm.
and in those moments, did you feel bad and this is wrong, or did in the moments did it seem like, oh, this is good, this is going to be fun, or
it felt, no, you know, I mean, really it came crashing down immediately after. You know, it was a lot of sexual energy, it was a lot of curiosity, it was a lot of playfulness. And again, that's one of the reasons why when I've looked back at it, I've had to really, again, backpedal of saying when I was 12, I was a, you know, sexual offender. And really, although, you know, I'm sure to somebody listening, that might be the right term for what I did at that time, you know? So it's a little, sketchy, I know. And that's the case with 12-year-old boy sexuality, yeah, in general.
That's I don't care what anyone else thought. That's why I'm like, what did you decide, and when did almost immediately you felt this was wrong? Yeah. I'm a bad person. I've done something here.
Exactly. So yeah. So that's the piece of that, and really the reason I start there, you know, is because I grew up feeling, you know, for the next few years as though I was a really, really bad person, and I couldn't tell anybody about what I did, and I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell anybody about that until I was in my 20s. I just completely kept it in, and I talk about everything generally. So that took a lot of energy for me to keep that in. Fast forward now, I'm, you know, certainly more sexually mature. I'm in high school. I'm in the choir and the band. I went to a high school that had an incredibly competitive music program. I played trumpet. I sang. I was in every single fucking, you know, musical group that the school had, and it was just a full-time job for me. Both the band and the choir teacher were, you know, very intense personalities, and were very demanding of the students. And you know, if you were in their good graces, you absolutely, you know, they were parents to you as they were to me. So fast forwarding, because there's a lot more to all this, just to kind of get the data and the details out there. My choir teacher invited me in for private music lessons, and this, you can start to hear, this becomes a much more common grooming and kind of abuse story. So private music lessons for over the course of 2 years, wherein, you know, behind closed doors, and there was no windows on the doors that were closed and locked. And during the lessons, he would do breathing exercises with me, and during which he would, you know, slide his hand down my pants. And so that happened weekly, kind of here and there, in these lessons for over the course of a year and a half, 2 years or so. The thing that in some ways, it was a common enough thing that I knew what was going on. I knew that was bad, that was abusive. But when put into the context of what I was already feeling emotionally about what I had done and that I was a bad person, and the fact that I was, an older victim of sexual abuse, an older male victim, these things start to kind of be less and less common. And so the alienation that I felt and was really strong. And yet I was part of this amazing, beautiful, supportive family in the choir and the band. And I absolutely adored and loved the teacher who was doing this to me. And let's see, again, fast forwarding through a lot of the drama of those few years, the end of my junior year, I left the choir, and I decided that something needed to be done. I started learning that this was happening to so many other boys. What I now think was probably hundreds of boys over the course of a number of years through these private music lessons. And I started to really hate him and really resent not just the sexual piece of it, but a lot of the emotional abuse that was going along with it, a lot of the manipulation, which again, in such a competitive environment, it was very, very strong. So strong in terms of rewards that I was getting for singing well, and also for being one of his minions in his inner circle. So I quit the choir and I decided to report it. And I started talking to other boys, and 2 other boys joined me. And I spent my entire senior year of high school in the reporting process, going to the school, going to a therapist, having the therapist say I need to go and report it, telling both of my parents. It was a drawn out long year of that. Then I get to college and I was so really hurting from this experience. I needed to get really far away from where I grew up. So I flew all the way out to New Mexico to go to college. I grew up in New York on Long Island, go to school in New Mexico. And while I'm in like one of my first days of college, I find out that they finally arrested him. It was all over the newspapers and media. And the next few years were me flying back and forth a number of times to the East Coast from school, having to take time out of school to be part of the trial and school, Board of Education hearings and stuff like that. Long story short with that, he was found not guilty on all charges, which for me, interestingly, at that point, I felt a great deal of relief. I never wanted him to at that point, I never wanted him to go to jail forever. I didn't want him to encounter more pain than he already had. These are very common things that kids feel about, their abuser. And I, let's see, he's found not guilty. I feel relieved. A number of years go by. I go to graduate school, become a psychotherapist, had no intention to do sexual abuse work per se. I actually had, in the interim of this, I got involved with the Mankind Project right after I graduated from college. And that's really what made me want to be a therapist. I said, I want to do this work professionally. So I go out to California, start graduate school. Let's see. I find out that he dies right when I'm starting graduate school. And I drive a number of hours to go to his funeral, to kneel at his casket with, open casket, see his dead body right in front of me. And right after that, I find out that my internship placement in graduate school is to work in a prison with incarcerated sex offenders. So I start doing that work, and I do that for about a year and a half. After that, I work with juvenile sex offenders, or, you know, boys with sexually problematic behavior, as, you know, it's a little more correct term these days. And fast forward another couple of years, I got so fucking fed up and with the systems and the work I was doing, really feeling burnt out, and I took time off. I went and hiked the Appalachian Trail, the whole thing. I just got back from that and just got a job doing child sexual abuse prevention training work, which is what I've been doing it for like a week now with a cool organization called Stop It Now. So that's my that's those are the facts.
Well, I invite you to first. You have tremendous balls and courage for putting that all out there, for surviving it, for continuing to almost be called to that work that you know, life has kind of put you through the ringer around, and just the way you just stated, so matter of factly. Don't know if that's good or bad, but I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you're sharing your story.
You know, I'm shaking inside, of course, you know, as I'm talking about this, but it is something I've done before, you know, tell the whole story in its entirety and a number of times. And I think it kind of, it like I was said before, it makes me nervous. It makes me shake inside. It's a lot easier to do it now than it used to be. And I don't think it's fair to talk about this stuff without some real emotional experience for myself being part of it, you know, to really make it real. So yeah, humanizing sexual abuse. That's
Yeah. You know, Ben, first of all, I have to say, I have to agree with Andy that it's incredibly courageous of you to be able to put yourself out there and speak of it, even though you've spoken of it in the past. One of the things I've observed in talking to other people who've also gone through sexual abuse is that even, you know, years and years and years could have gone past, and they never are able to get, you know, it never gets easier. The telling of the story truly never gets easier on an emotional level. Right. There's always that terror. There's always that, you know, feeling the shaking on the inside. But at the same time, you know, I certainly have to add my voice to say thank you for sharing that deeply personal story. One of the things I've been curious about as you were telling your story, how much of that experience has allowed you to really be able to connect and empathize with the people that you've worked with?
Right. So I'm glad you asked that, because it brings me back to some of the moments that things really crystallized in the work for me when it went and basically the process, and it ties into what you were just saying, Appio and Andy, that the telling and the retelling of it, and I think this is a common enough experience again with, you know, people who've experienced sexual abuse, is, or any trauma really, it goes from being my story, my neurotic, internalized secret world, to being not mine anymore. It's the world's. It's and I don't mean that in a woo woo way. I mean that in a very I feel that in my heart when I tell it, and the amount of energy that gets released when I'm able to move through it in that way and hold it in that way is really, really powerful for me, and I think really informs the work that I do. And the moment well, this is a longer detailed experience, I won't get into it too much, but it really happened when I was working in the prison. My abuser was dead. I saw his dead, cold body in front of me. I cried my fucking eyes out. And he was a young guy. I don't just, you know, for what it's worth, I don't know if how he died. I don't know if he took his life, or if there were natural causes. So there was some residual weight from that not knowing, why he died, in the form of guilt for me around having been the one to report him and really bring to a grinding halt the empire that he had built. Right. So anyway, he's dead, and I'm working in prison, and I'm seeing these men, 84 of them, on a devoted cell block that was a therapeutic community for sex offenders. It's all groups all the time. There was no individual therapy. So I'm just sitting in circle with these men, getting the opportunity, the privilege, really, which I've really come to think of it as that a lot of victims of sexual abuse, I don't get to have to sit in a circle in prison with men working on their shit around, being perpetrators. But it was going through all the rage and all the anger that I felt toward the inmates I was working with, and actually being given permission by the program and the supervisor I was working with to actually channel that frustration in a healthy, professional, therapeutic way, that allowed me to, I think, start to see them as who they were and less as, the being like the man who abused me.
So seeing them just not as offenders, seeing other aspects of them more than.
Yeah, I mean, seeing them weep, seeing them scream, seeing them be scary assholes, seeing them in their full humanity, and in a way that I was obviously too young at the time to have seen my own abuser when that was happening. I couldn't see him as human. He wasn't a monster to me. He was a powerful God, and yet some of these men I met in prison, when I first encountered them, they did have the scales of monsters. They did have the presentation of just absolute creep. I mean, a lot of the stereotypes are real for some of these guys, and yet to look at them long enough and to be with them and to sit with them and to heal myself, during that process, allowed me to really start to ask some really, really important fundamental questions about all this. Like, why does this happen? And that's a whole other conversation.
You can't just answer that in a quick sentence, no?
Man.
No, I can't do that one on Twitter.
I can give it a shot, but it's, it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's the reason why people do things, why people do anything. It's always complicated. It's always really complicated. Sex is so fucking complicated.
Yeah. It's interesting because one of the things I've certainly noticed in that field is that it is the reasons of why are almost as unique as the individual themselves.
Right.
Which makes it so complicated because you might be able to draw certain conclusions based off of commonalities and patterns and things like that. But ultimately, what drives a person to do what they do ultimately ends up, at least this is just my own observation off of conversations that I've had, has been that it is uniquely, the decision is uniquely theirs. It is unique to them.
Right.
In spite of commonalities that they might share with other folks.
And isn't that so true in any realm of the mental health field, with any mental health diagnosis, with any person labeled as a schizophrenic? What triggers their psychotic episodes? It's what's going on in their life. It's as subjective and as sticky and complicated as that person. And that they are not just a pedophile, a schizophrenic.
Yeah.
I say that lightly because I don't like lumping pedophilia right in there, with all the diagnoses as being the same thing, because it's not. But to that point of how incredibly complex and human every single story is, and every bit of it is, and that's something that I think as a society and as a mental health field, we've certainly come to appreciate that with victims as a society. I think more and more. My big beef, and this is speaking as both a victim and as a person who grew up seeing myself as a perpetrator, we don't do that with the other side of the story, with perpetrators, and we don't do that for very good reason. I mean, there's a million terrifying reasons and risks to humanizing offenders, but what happens is that I think in the mental health field in particular, in treatment, the specific treatment that victims often get is, I think, a lot of times leaves out the humanity of their particular perpetrator, their abuser. And that's a thing that I remember when I was 18 and I started seeing a therapist. I felt like I had to fight the therapist in order to include my feelings about this man that had done horrible things to me, but how much I cared about him and loved him. And that was, it was almost not welcome in the therapy. And I found that with other therapists, and I've worked with some amazing therapists as well. But it's the field, and I think society as a whole, we don't tell the two stories in parallel. We don't look at what happened from the victim's perspective and the perpetrator's perspective in this situation. We want victims to tell their stories, of course. We want perpetrators to tell their story, of course. Very seldom are they looked at in tandem.
It's presented, one of these people is good and one is bad, and we want to keep it that clean and nice.
Yeah, and it needs, it's tricky too, because it needs to be that clean in some really basic ways too. I think for accountability to work the way it needs to work, there does need to be a degree of good and bad, especially for kids.
Sure.
It doesn't work if it's not true if it's too gray, if it's too wishy-washy, and it starts to, because then you're into blaming the victim territory, which is really not the point of finding nuance in these stories. So the real trick, I was trying to think about how I would talk about this tonight with you guys, and I think what it really comes down to, and what I love knowing that, Andy, you just did the Mankind Project weekend, and we can talk about some of the teachings of that, is that in this sexual abuse work with victims, and more so with perpetrators, it comes down to, how do you hold a man accountable? And I say man because, the vast majority of perpetrators are men. How do you hold a man accountable and also love him at the same time? And to me, that's also the core of the work, the men's work that we do together. That has nothing to do with sexual abuse necessarily, or treatment or anything. It's just this dialectic of love and care and tough love and accountability.
Right, because if you just label someone a monster, well, there's nothing we can do. Put them away forever. That's the end, and it kind of denies any aspect of humanity.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's amazing, and it's the thing that's always the hardest, but it's always also the most fun and interesting, working with offenders, whether the kids I've worked with, the juvenile offenders or adults is this drama that's always unfolding at the facilities that I've worked in about whether you're being too soft or too hard, and it's really the treatment is finding the right balance between accountability and nurturing. And I just think that's just also so true for us as men and in the world in general,
Yeah.
And that a lot of the men's work that includes our history of violence, and also our current needs as men in this world that we live in today is really about synthesizing love and accountability. That's
Right.
Comes down to something like that.
I've heard you speak about accountability, several times now, and it sounds to me like the big struggle with not only treatment but also just the conversations in general, self conversations as well as conversations with the people that you're working with, is how do you strike how can you hold somebody accountable while at the same time, and just kind of rephrasing what you said, just
right.
so I can understand this better.
Sure.
How do you hold them accountable while at the same time not judging them and not applying the labels that could potentially stick with them for the rest of their life, that could be potentially reinforce a harmful conversation that they're having?
Right. And I exactly. And I think the coolest thing, cool, maybe that's not the right word. The most interesting and important thing is that when you get that question right about how do you do both of those simultaneously, when you get that right in the world of sex offender treatment, it's a public safety issue. You're preventing future offenses when those guys get out of prison. You can't, it doesn't work if it's just toughness and no love. It actually doesn't. Those guys get out and they're alienated and they're angry and they have no social skills and have never been loved in their lives, some of them, and they reoffend. Of course they do.
Right.
So when you nail that balance between those poles, and to me, again, that's like when you nail, mature masculinity. So what was starting to happen in the prison is I started seeing some of these guys. I started actually getting jealous of them, of the work that they were able to do in this intensive 24/7 therapeutic community that is not the way the rest of the world is. And what a fucking weird backwards thing for me to think and say, that I was jealous of inmates getting and of course, some of them are just still total assholes and they'll always be assholes. I'm not, none of them were necessarily the most
not a collection of lucky bastards entirely then.
Right.
Yeah. But when I started to understand those dynamics, I was like, fuck, every man needs that, a community that can give that.
So this is what you mean by humanizing it, and I want to be careful that humanizing perpetrators of any violent act is not the same as like normalizing it and saying it's okay.
Absolutely.
It's just realizing, it's not just a monster. We presented one aspect, and it's easy to judge and label, and monster put you away forever, and you should be dead.
And what I learned when I learned working in the prison, and I've tried to stay true to this, is humanizing not only doesn't mean normalizing, but it means also expressing the rage that I feel toward those acts, toward those men having done those acts, from the fullness of my humanity. Really, really not holding back on that either. That's super, super important. When I've toured around some sex offender treatment programs, I've worked in a couple, as I said, but I've come to learn the field a little bit. You do sometimes see that kind of holding back and that coddling, which again is bad treatment for those guys. They need to actually hear the fullness of the rage that their victim feels, that society feels, that it is not okay ever.
Right.
and have that be done in a nurturing, loving way, and be held in a community while hearing that. It's too bad this program I was working in Rhode Island is, no longer exists, because it was just fucking phenomenal the way that they pulled that off.
You said something that kind of struck me, and it kind of goes along with a theme that seems to be emerging quite regularly in conversations that I've had with folks, which is compassion versus understanding. Coming to understand the individual in order to help them achieve the fullness of their humanity, and embrace that totality of themselves and the humanness and everything else. And compassion, while it's a wonderful, beautiful human trait, can also hold us back, can keep us from being able to move on, because the compassion almost provides a platform for justification, a platform for being able to continue the story, because it's like, oh, it's okay, without the accountability that's actually there. And so where do we stop being compassionate? Where do we move toward understanding, so that we can basically, let's stop this shit, and let's get things working properly.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And if, I'm a therapist that's often super critical of therapy and therapists.
Most are, funny enough. I've discovered that.
Yeah. And this is what my podcast is going to be about when I start a podcast, by the way, is therapists talking about therapy.
Therapists putting down therapy.
Yeah, and propping it up when it's appropriate. But no, but I think it's, to what you were just saying. Really, being nice doesn't cut it all the time, and that's really the Mankind Project, the work, the men's movement starting in the 70s was certainly a response to it was a counter movement to men losing a kind of or I would say confusing niceness with strength. And I think a lot of our ideas about mature masculinity started to be born at that point. Mature modern masculinity, not toughness, but strength and courage,
right.
Invulnerability.
Right.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how when we as men are vulnerable, how incredibly invulnerable we also become to all of the stuff that can be thrown at us.
Yes, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but I like the words.
Yeah, well, it's just something that kind of like just kind of occurred to me just now, how in our vulnerability we somehow managed to embrace the totality of our humanness, the totality of who we are as human beings, as and those who tend to be a bit more spiritual, spiritual beings having a human experience. And in the process, we make ourselves invulnerable to so many things, because we give ourselves permission to be fully, completely who we are.
Right. That's right. I what I hear in that is something along the lines of vulnerability and emotional expressiveness, which I guess is the whole thing you guys are doing on this podcast, right? That is a protective measure. That's a defense. That's ultimately a defense mechanism that we humans have developed to be in the world, to be present in the world, and be strong in the world. And it's not the same as toughness.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool.
So I have some experience in this world, a little different. When I was 5, I was molested by a neighbor, and it happened repeatedly, and I didn't remember it until I was in my 20s.
Wow.
After multiple suicide attempts. And I remember thinking, as I remembered it, like, oh my God, since I was molested, this means I'm going to become a molester.
Right.
So I wondered if that's a myth, if that really common, are most of the guys you deal with, the offenders, had all been something that had been done to them, and this was kind of this hurt that gets presented, passed on.
I mean, I almost want to turn it back onto you a little bit and ask you what you think. I mean, and I mean, thank you for sharing that piece of it too, your experience. It does sound like you, as well as a lot of people that have experienced abuse, you do kind of internalize that social message of, this must mean I will hurt somebody, because hurt people. Or in the case of sexual abuse, this cycle of violence, I mean, is that something that you lived with,
It's certainly about? Yeah, it's something that's certainly very worried about. And I was still never, was this something I decided myself? Was it from too many talk shows and news programs?
Right.
There was also, when I was having the memories, there was a big, thing of children were making up memories, and you couldn't trust these things. And I'm like, oh, did I just make this up? Now I don't know what. Can I believe my own memories? Can I? I was really just lost for a long time. But it did make me, look and like, was I ever abused? Was that situation? Was I, an equal willing party, open to whatever happened, or was I somehow an aggressor? Could I have turned bad? Did I? I was looking at all these different, almost every interaction I ever had with any person. See, was I, am I a monster, right? Am I dehumanizing myself because I had been a victim?
Right. Yes, exactly. I mean, I can relate to that so strongly. My experience, dating in college for me, didn't exist because of that. I was so terrified when I, from having experienced both of these sides of abuse, that I couldn't possibly do anything sexually without it being harmful to somebody. Like that's just something I lived with, and I was terrified as a result of not just my sexuality, but my agency as my heart in the world. I couldn't flirt with a girl I was attracted to. I mean, it really, really, talk about emasculation. I think that fear is very powerful. So to your question, I think the best way to put it, right, is that when you go into a prison, say, and you look at a room full of sex offenders, the chances that they have experienced sexual abuse themselves is extremely high. That's also true across the board for other non-sexual kinds of offenders, murderers, guys that are in prison for a lot of other reasons. So sexual abuse it's extremely common in an inmate population. And of course that overlaps with high mental illness rates, and there's a lot swirling around there in a prison population. But is it a cause? I actually just had this conversation with my mom the other night. I don't remember what we were talking about, but she was asking me a similar thing about causation, and it's kind of hard. Yeah, it's kind of hard to explain it. I don't see it as necessarily a cause. And again, that part of that is because, for example, not every sexual abuser is a pedophile that abuses a child. In fact, something like 10% of men who have sexual abuse charges on them are considered pedophiles, and meaning attracted to younger children generally. So it's much more situational, actually, the abuse situations that happen. And like Appio, you were saying earlier, trying to remember what you were saying earlier.
I don't always remember. So
but I saw you making a face about that, or reacting in some way to that thing I was just saying about not every child sexual abuser is a pedophile.
Right. Yeah.
That's a really, really, really key, important point, I think, to begin to understand what is actually going on then for the vast majority of child sexual abuse situations and cases.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, this is just how I perceive it on a purely, energetic level. No scientific evidence whatsoever to back it up or whatever. But the way I perceive it on an energetic level is that these are people who are somehow trying to recapture a sense of innocence that they felt that they lost. That's what it feels like to me.
I would say, in my experience, that is true for some guys, and is true in less cases than you might think.
Right.
That is certainly true for, there's all these different little subgroups that I came up with when I was working with inmates, and one of them certainly is the recapture innocence group, right. And not all of them are diagnosed pedophiles, and or even undiagnosed pedophiles. Diagnosis not being part of it, meaning like having a either an exclusive or a non-exclusive attraction to young children. A man can still sexually abuse a young child without having a general attraction to young children. Now,
right.
And this is where it starts to get a little, to me, and when I talk to guys about this subject, it starts to move into this territory of like, wait, so I could do that? Like, it starts to get a little scarier in terms of it moving away from this, monsters and angels story, more toward a story about human beings and what happens to human males in our lives, and
right.
sexual feelings and sexual situations. And there's a billion reasons why. And again, that recapture innocence I've seen that for sure. And it's
certainly not totally, but certainly for those who appear, I would say, who tend to focus exclusively on the young children, versus those who that's just maybe a group to whom they have had, they've expressed themselves sexually or whatever.
Yeah. The thing that woke me up to that originally was when I'm sitting in a group of a child molesters group in prison. There's like, let's say 15 guys, and most of them are hating on and yelling at, shaming the one guy who's talking about how he is attracted to young children.
Right.
And they're all calling him a pedophile. And I was scratching my head like, what the fuck? Like, I thought they're all pedophiles. Like, and right. It took me some time to really listen to them and say, no, this situation that I got into with my niece, or whoever
whoever the victim was, right?
Whoever the victim or victims were,
right?
It's like, no, I'm so many of these guys, and I really had to start to believe them. Some of them, not all of them, because it's obviously it's the last thing you want to admit in prison is that you're sexually attracted to young children. I get that. That's
sure.
Forthright about that, but then I started reading more and realizing, that there's really good, not a lot, but there is some research about how low the prevalence of pedophilic offenders are. The flip side of that is that the serial pedophilic offender typically has about 10 times more victims than the non-pedophile. So there's a lot more victims per offender.
Right.
And then there's also the group of pedophiles, if you believe this is a real truth thing, which I absolutely do and know in my heart that it's a true real thing. There are the guys who don't ever offend, who don't ever act out. And there's interestingly, and this is something I'm learning about in my new job with prevention, there's virtual groups online of, one is called VERPED, virtuous pedophiles. People, and I at this point should stop saying men. It's men and women and kids even who are. Oh, cops just went by.
I think you're safe.
Yeah, I hope so. It's a really charged conversation, I know. Who are committed to not acting out.
So then, definition-wise, so is pedophilia the sexual attraction and versus just a power trip, abusing someone because they're there, or?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah, I think that exactly. I think that more and more the definition, it's not. It's kind of a false equivalent to call it a sexual orientation in some senses, because it is so tied into abuse and offending and legal definitions and things, but it more and more, I think, it will start to be seen, at least in the mental health community and the forensic treatment communities, as a sexual orientation. Meaning, I am generally attracted to young children. It doesn't mean I'm attracted to every single one. I might also be attracted to adults. So again, that's where that exclusive pedophile versus non-exclusive goes. And I really see that treatment moving hopefully more and more in the direction of understanding that and actually actively finding those people to have them find a way to come out of the darkest, dankest closet in our society to support each other. That's something
And so these are peer support groups that these online groups of trying to help each other. And I guess, because there's no
far between. Yeah.
Where there's, I mean, that's the most like a taboo, beyond taboo subject that you can't openly, like this show, we're having conversations that people aren't having. But yeah,
sure.
Confessing your pedophilia attractions and, that's a tough conversation to have. So
sure. If anybody listening, and for you guys too, there's a This American Life episode from about maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I forget the name of it. Shit. But it's a, there's half of the radio show is devoted to a kid coming out. I think he's like 18 at the time, and he comes out as a pedophile and starts this online support group. And it's just one of my favorite episodes of This American Life. They really, really, they nail it, and they go after, they don't just go after this subject, but they go after it in a way that that gives promise and some kind of vision of a solution down the road.
That's interesting. Just to kind of change gears here really quick.
Sure.
In the chat, Lori had put in a question about male-to-male abuse. In your practice, in your experience, have you noticed if boys get blamed the same way that women do in that abusive situation where the victim, the male victim, especially in the younger cases, the pedophilia cases, do the boys get blamed?
In the sense of blaming the victim.
That young boy was dressed in a way that he deserved it. That kind of stereotypical.
No, I mean, certainly not. Right. I mean, that's there's almost an obvious flippant answer I can give about it, which is like, no, of course they weren't wearing a skirt, probably, but the punishment, if you will, the weight of it, I think is I'll put it this way: whenever I see statistics about the prevalence of male victims, I never believe them, because I think that it's even more grossly underreported than female victims. You see, like, it's like 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10, maybe you see sometimes up to like 1 in 20 males at some time. It depends on how the statistics are written, but every time I see that, I'm like, that's because of the problem with men and masculinity and secret keeping and shame and lack of emotional expression, and every single problem we know us men have. That's 1 in 20. Come on, like, so
right, yeah.
the secrecy is very, very heavy. To see guys in prison in their 50s, 60s, 70s talk about their sexual abuse, and not to say that's exclusive to men, to go that long without understanding or telling or even realizing, the experiences they had as a young child, but to see a man in his 60s say, get that off of his chest, but also it seemed for the first time in his life be given permission to have a fucking emotion about anything. I think that, to me, is one way to kind of parse the difference, that in the way that men and women hold sexual abuse in our society, as victims. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
One way I certainly see victims change differently is like young girls sexually abused when raped. Oh, it's a tragedy, it's horrible. And if young boys have a relationship with teachers, that's the most common thing. I was like, oh, yeah, go get him. Yeah, what a lucky kid. Yeah, and
absolutely.
Absolutely.
There. Right. Yeah, there's that, and plus, there's also to kind of speaking to what you just said, Ben, about this idea that we have to be tough, and men are perpetrators, not victims. Men can't possibly be victims because they're supposed to be tough. They're supposed to be able to fight off, whoever it is that's abusing them or whatever.
Right.
And
yeah, God, it sorry,
no, go for it.
It reminds me of this idea that I keep having when I do work with men who are victims or boys, is the victim perpetrator paradigm, came out of, it seems to me, came out of a movement of women coming forward and, in the last half of the 20th century, and rape crisis centers, and victim hotlines, and I mean the whole movement really being born out of that. And sometimes I think that because it speaks to the history of misogyny and of women's oppression and liberation, victim works in a way, I think, for women in a way that, when I was treating adolescent boys who were offenders and incarcerated, and it was the last identity they would ever take on was victim. And I had to, and it's so true for, I think, people that do that work, I kind of have to find a way to talk about what happened to them without ever using the word victim. And it's not, it doesn't, I don't think it works in the same way socially. And I'll tell you from my own experience that when I first saw that first therapist when I was 18, and then did all my reporting and, was talking to the district attorney and the school board about all of it, they kept calling me a victim and saying, because it's part of, therapist training 101 is, when someone comes in as a victim, make sure that they know that they're a victim. And that has some good intention behind it. Obviously it's saying, like, make sure this wasn't your fault, et cetera, et cetera. But it was the humiliation of I went from feeling powerful and in control of what had happened to me when I reported it to then being called a victim. It just didn't fit. And I think, it took me a lot of years to be more comfortable with that term, the way that I can now. And part of it's also because, again, I was an older teenager when I was abused, and I had all the things that happened to me before then. I think, Andy, not to call you a victim, but as a 5-year-old, one is a victim, I think, in a different way than.
And I would suggest, we can all be victimized without being again, the label of, oh, you're a victim. That feels like it's your entire existence, right? But no, you could be victimized in moments, but, or you're, the abused, the assaulted, the whatever. But no, I mean, I get what you're saying, because you can feel empowered. I'm speaking up. I'm fighting for myself. I'm standing up and putting an end to this. Oh, you poor little victim. Let's help you stop feeling bad. Like, wait, what? You just weakened me.
Yeah, and let us. Yeah, and there was the message in there of we've got this. We can handle this. You don't know anything. You don't know what happened to you. That's what it was. It was, and it, again, back to that dehumanizing experience. What was dehumanizing was having other people think that they know what I was feeling or what happened to me, and calling me a victim and saying, there's textbooks written about you. We know what happened. That is dehumanizing to both victims, to offenders, and it doesn't work. It's not effective treatment.
I find it really, we talk about this often up, is the label. Anytime someone tries to throw a single word on you, it's like, oh, it doesn't feel good, no matter what the word is. Right?
Yeah, exactly. My mom always used to tell me when I was growing up, you can do two things with the label. You can either, wear it, or you can tell the other person that gave it to you to lick it and stick it. You just stick it somewhere else.
Yeah. And again, I think and I don't mean to harp on this difference between men and women thing, but I don't walk down the street. I'll put it this way. I walk down the street waving a lot of different flags. I'm proud of a lot of different things in my life, a lot of different identities, a lot of different movements that I'm part of. And one of them is not male victim of sexual abuse. There is not a fucking movement for me or for you. Like, there's a little bit, there's men's stuff. But it doesn't fit into a social movement, at least not right now. Or, maybe there's this podcast and, the Mankind Project and some other things are moving us a little more into like a social normalcy. But
and those shouldn't be normalized. I hope they're not normal experiences for every child growing up in America. But
unfortunately, they are for a lot of people.
But I think why I'm so glad you're here today and talking about this and sharing it. I think it goes back to the things we have talked about being vulnerable, right? And authenticity. That's what beyond being a modern man and modern masculinity. It's being a human being,
right?
Authentic, vulnerable, and the more vulnerable, the more you share what you think is the deepest, darkest, secretest, most shitty thing about you, and we didn't hang up on you, right? We didn't end this call like, oh, Ben's a bad guy, we gotta get out of here, right?
Yeah.
Again, you realize, wow, this experience
right.
does happen to more and more people, which can bring you together. And we don't need flags and parades.
Yeah,
we do need to talk about
it. Yeah.
I mean, from a real kind of like, it gets better sort of place in my heart. I just say to anybody who I encounter that telling the deepest, darkest secret you have, which for me was, the things I've talked about. Not only is it a weight off your chest eventually, but it does require going through these moments of feeling like the world will end, that death is, and oh man, something is dying in that moment. When I was as a 13-year-old, when I went on the internet, which was brand new at the time, and I looked up sexual abuse perpetrator, I had this, it was a religious experience for me. I looked up at the sky and I thought, God would eliminate me in that moment for admitting to myself, there was no one else around even, but just to admitting to myself that deep, dark secret had actually happened. And when it didn't happen, first of all, I stopped believing in God right after that, which is a whole other podcast, but temporarily at least. But to, living through, I think, sexual abuse in some ways for me pales in comparison, in some ways, to living through those moments of admitting it. Those are the really intense moments of fear. And that's my experience. I'm certainly not speaking for others.
That you mentioned the part of you that feels like it's dying when you're sharing that, talking about it. I would suggest that's the victim, right? That victim is who died, and you're not sure if you can go on without that. And so you find it you can.
Right. Yeah. And now I'm like, I'm not a victim anymore. I never was a perpetrator, I don't think. Like and again, that's come from, not just doing my therapy and everything, but also doing this work and telling the stories over and over again. It's like, I'm just me. I'm a human, and man, it just sounds so corny to say that, but it really is, true to my heart. It doesn't, because before that I was a monster. Before that I was a victim. And it doesn't feel that way anymore.
Saying I'm a human is probably one of the most empowering things you can do and say.
Sure. To feel, I think especially from when I was a young kid, those feelings of alienation from humanity. If it's true that the deepest, most fundamental question we do ask ourselves as humans is, do I belong? Am I part of? And to feel not part of, the shame and the exclusion of, which of course we've, as a society, given to pedophiles and child molesters, which in some ways is certainly deserved, as I'm keep reiterating over and over again.
Right now,
not to excuse it in any way, but that is I would say that's the most intense feeling I've ever felt. If this is a podcast about men talking about our feelings, the most intense feeling I have ever felt is that alienation from the human race. And like you said, Appio, to claim the opposite is very powerful if you have felt the other way.
Very true.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this has been a profound and powerful conversation. Again, I want to thank you, Ben, for showing up, for being you, for bringing it. And this seems silly as hell to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. Glad you're part of the human race. Welcome to the show. Right?
Welcome to the family.
Thank you guys very, very much. I think it's I'll just say it's rare to be given as much of a platform to go through the whole thing and to talk honestly about it and to be heard and have a conversation about it, in public. It's just a gift. So thank you guys very much for what you're doing, and I'll keep listening for sure. Maybe come back sometime.
Yeah. You've got a lot to say. Cool. Glad to have you again.
All right.
Real Men Feel will be live again next Tuesday, January 17th, 8 p.m. Eastern. We're talking with relationship and dating coach Brandon Havener, talking about tapping into your feminine side to improve dating and relationships. So again, we've talked about lots of different shows. You're not just masculine, you're not just feminine. We're all humans. We blur all the lines. We can go different places, tap into different energies and feelings. And it's a good thing. Thank you again, Ben. Thank you, Appio, as always, for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll talk to you all next week. Thanks for listening.
Good night, guys.